These are individuals who were leaders of the Communist Party from the 1930s up into the 1950s. The Communist Party of the United States was formed in 1919, but it was really during the Great Depression that it really gained a lot of strength by building unemployment councils and fighting for the rights of the unemployed and building industrial unions. At that time, the American Federation of Labor would only unionize people they considered to be skilled, whereas the communists wanted to unionize all workers, and it was the communists with the Trade Union Unity League and eventually, building the CIO that brought the steel industry and the auto industry and the meat packers and got those good union wages. We hear about those good union jobs that used to exist. Well, that's because of these people who built the industrial union. The individual that I know the most about here is William Z. Foster. William Z. Foster was from an Irish family in Philadelphia, and he joined the Industrial Workers of the World. He was a founding member of the Communist Party, and lived just an amazing life. The death date here is actually not correct. He died in 1961 in the Soviet Union. This is the date that they buried him. It was after his widow, Esther Foster. She had died as well. And William Z. Foster actually died in the Soviet Union because he was an elderly man. The National Board of the Communist Party were put on trial for conspiracy to teach the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. William Z. Foster was so old at the time and he had a heart condition, he didn't end up going on trial. He was declared not fit to stand trial. And it was, just a few years before his death that they finally gave him a passport and allowed him to go to the Soviet Union. And he spent his last couple of years in the Soviet Union in a hospital bed, and he ultimately died. But his last act was on his 80th birthday in 1961. He was born in 1881, and for his 80th birthday, Khrushchev came to visit him in his hospital bed. And at the time, the Soviet Union and China had just had their falling out. And from his hospital bed, elderly 80-year-old William Z. Foster, there with the Soviet leader, read a speech honoring Mao Zedong and honoring the Chinese Revolution as an act of defiance against Khrushchev. And that was his last act, and he died several months later. And that was William Z. Foster. This was his widow, Esther Foster. What's interesting is that William Z. Foster, he never had any children through Esther, but Esther had 3 children at the time they got married. So Esther had 3 children from a previous marriage. And I guess they met at a commune in upstate New York, and they fell in love, and they got married. William Z. Foster actually dedicated his last book to his grandson, Joseph Manley Kolko, and the book is called The Twilight of World Capitalism, and the book is dedicated to my grandson, Joseph Manley Kolko, who will live in a communist United States of America. That's the dedication of his book. Now, this guy is Eugene Dennis. And Eugene Dennis, he was the person who acted as kind of the primary spokesperson for the Communist Party during the McCarthy hearings. At the time when they were calling Communist Party leaders before the House Un-American Activities Committee, they basically said if you could either take the Fifth Amendment and then you couldn't answer any questions, or if you answered some questions, you had to answer all the questions, or you would go to jail for contempt. And so Eugene Dennis, he was the one who was kind of given the permission to go and read a statement before the U.S. Congress representing the Communist Party. Everyone else took the Fifth Amendment. So he came in prepared to make a statement before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but they knew that his birth name was not actually Eugene Dennis. He was born under another name. He changed his name to Eugene Dennis. And so rather than let him read his statement, they demanded of him, "What is your name?" And there's a clip you can watch of him before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they're asking him, "What is your name?" He said, "My name is Eugene Dennis." And they say, "Well, what name were you born with?" He says, "My name is Eugene Dennis. I pay taxes under that name, and never under this name or any other name have I ever dishonored the United States of America." And then the congressman, who's asking him, he says, "What's your name?" And the guy says his name, and he says, "You're a poll taxer. You're a supporter of Jim Crow segregation. That's who you are." And he was held in contempt of Congress for doing so. Quite a defiant stance that he took. That's Eugene Dennis. Now, Jack Johnstone, he was a close associate of William Z. Foster. So William Z. Foster, before he joined the Communist Party, he was a wobbly, but the IWW had a policy that they would not join any union that wasn't communist, that wasn't revolutionary. And William Z. Foster said that was cutting them off from the majority of workers. So Jack Johnstone and William Z. Foster, they broke away from the Wobblies and they formed the Syndicalist League of North America. And they came here to Chicago and they worked for the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, and they kind of infiltrated the local AFL and they organized the meat-packing workers into unions, which was a huge accomplishment. And the way they did it was World War I was happening at the time, and meat was essential. You needed meat to get to those soldiers out on the front so they could fight. And so what they did is they held public hearings here in Chicago where children who worked in the factories would testify about the bad conditions. People who'd lost their hands or an arm or a leg in the machines would get up and testify. And the press was there, and it was just showing the bad conditions and then hinting that they might go on strike, even though it was illegal during the war to have a strike. They never actually threatened to strike because that would have been illegal. But they had these public hearings testifying about the really awful conditions in these meatpacking facilities and how people lost body parts and children worked for pennies an hour. These were immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Ireland, and from Italy largely. There were some black people from the South who had migrated up, but it was largely Eastern Europeans, Irish and Italian workers. And through this kind of public relations campaign and the hint of a strike, President Woodrow Wilson brought in an arbitrator and they forced the meatpacking houses of Chicago to sign a union contract and recognize the Stockyards Labor Federation. And based on that, William Z. Foster and Jack Johnstone went to the AFL and they said, we want to do this in the steel industry. And so they launched the steel strike of 1919, which was one of the biggest strikes in American history. It was right as World War I had ended. Workers all across the country, something like 365,000 workers in the steel industry walked off the job, demanding that they get a union contract in the steel industry. And it was like a pitched battle. And in many states, there were many deaths on the picket line. Many people were killed. And they called William Z. Foster and Jack Johnstone to the White House. And President Woodrow Wilson assumed that because they were in a union, they must be very ignorant. So President Woodrow Wilson spoke to them in what Foster called roughneck talk when he met with them. And he said, this strike you're having is hurting our economy. You need to sign a contract, and it was a big incident. The other thing is that William Z. Foster, he'd been a wobbly and a radical. So he was called before Congress during the strike, and they had one of his pamphlets that he had written as an anarchist or whatever. And they said, now, do you still believe this? And he said, oh, no, that was my youth. And 2 years later, he was a founding member of the Communist Party, so he was completely lying through his teeth. He was completely lying through his teeth, but he pretended to be a moderate in order to not have the strike broken up by the government. But the strike was not successful. They lost. And after the strike was lost, William Z. Foster was considered discredited by the American labor movement. He was a failure. They had this huge strike, and it had been defeated. So he went back to work as a railroad worker. He was a car knocker. He had a big hammer, and when a train would derail or whatever, his job was to, knock the car back so it could, and he was a car knocker. But Lenin sent an invitation to William Z. Foster from Moscow and invited him to go to the Soviet Union, where they were trying to form a new international labor federation. And when William Z. Foster got to Moscow, he met with Lenin, and he found out that Lenin had been urging the American communists to support the steel strike the whole time, and that William Z. Foster's idea of what he called boring from within, joining the reformist labor unions and pushing them to be more radical, that was an idea that Lenin had as well. And the concept of the militant minority, boring from within, was something the Bolsheviks had done in Russia. And so on that basis, William Z. Foster left anarchism and became a communist leader. And it was here in Chicago that his organizing took place, and it was very key. There's a couple other people I'd like to talk about. This is Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the rebel girl. It says, the rebel girl, fighter for the working class emancipation. It's a good song. And yeah, the Rebel Girl is a song that Joe Hill wrote in honor of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was an Irish American in New York City. She had bright red hair, and she was known for soapbox agitating. She would stand on a soapbox, and back then there were no microphones. And she would stand on a soapbox and she would speak like this, because your voice projects more over a crowd if you do that. And there were certain techniques that the soapbox agitators would use. For example, they'd have an imaginary argument with somebody. They'd pretend the person who disagreed with them was standing next to them and have an imaginary argument. And they would point, and gestures were really important because most people were seeing you from far away. So you'd stand there and you'd make big gestures and you'd point and you'd speak. You'd try to project your voice up so it would carry more. That was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and she was known as the rebel girl of the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. And she went around agitating for the rights of workers on the job and to build the IWW. one of the most famous things she did was in Spokane, Washington, because all over the country they would have what they called free speech fights. Because in little towns, the Wobblies, the IWW would come and start preaching their message, and the town would have a city ordinance forbidding the preaching of radical ideas in the town. So if a radical came to the town and was arrested, the call would go out for people from all over the country to come to that town and get arrested. And so thousands of people would come to the town, and the jails would be full of people, and eventually the town would back down. And the longest free speech fight was in Spokane, Washington, where, thousands and thousands of people from all over the country went to Spokane, Washington to get arrested. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, she came all the way from New York to get arrested, and she made a point of when she got arrested, before she gave her speech they would arrest her for, she chained herself to a telephone pole. So the police would have to cut the chains to get her out, and they took her to the jail. And when she was in the jail, she found out that the jail was being used as a brothel by the police. The police were using the jail as a brothel. So she exposed that, and that in the national media, and it made a huge incident. And ultimately, the city of Spokane, Washington, gave in and said, you have the right to preach socialism in Spokane, Washington, and gave in. That was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. What's interesting is that William Z. Foster was her good friend, but she didn't join the Communist Party for many years. She didn't ultimately join the Communist Party until the 1930s because fascism was considered to be so much of a threat. She had concerns. She was kind of anti-authoritarian. She was a radical free spirit, so she didn't quite like the idea of Stalin and the Soviet Union. But when it became clear that the communists were at the center of the fight against fascism, then she ultimately saw that the communists were on the right side. She joined the Communist Party in the late 1930s. During World War II, she was a big member of the Communist Party, and then she was sent to federal prison as a member of the National Board of the Communist Party USA. And she was sent to federal prison in West Virginia, and she was in federal prison for many years, and she came out of prison, and she was a leader of the Communist Party until her death. I believe she died in the late 1964 is when she died. After she got out of prison, she toured Eastern Europe, and I've heard recordings of her. She toured Eastern Europe, and she said, many workers in Detroit and in Alabama and Kentucky and Minnesota and Chicago will be happy to know there is no unemployment in the Soviet Union or in any socialist country. And in fact, she said in her speech, when they bring in automation into the factory, the workers don't fear that they're going to lose their job from automation. They applaud because they're happy because the automation is going to make their jobs easier because there'll be less work to do. And that's the difference between the capitalist system and the socialist system. Is in capitalism, automation leads to poverty, and in socialism, automation and innovation leads to better abundance for all. And that was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a great anti-fascist, a great working class hero, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the rebel girl. So, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, presente! All right. Who else is here? Who else?